In a time when kings claimed God as their authority and the church held power over life and death, one man dared to ask a question. Not with a sword, but with a pen. His name was Marsilius of Padua, and his question would echo through centuries, quietly shaking the foundations of power. This is the story of a mind that lived in the 1300s but spoke to the future, our future. Marsilius was born in a world of rigid hierarchies. At the top was God. Below him, the Pope and the Emperor, both claiming to be his chosen instruments on earth. For ordinary people, this order was as fixed as the stars. To challenge it was not just treason, it was heresy. But Marsilius, a scholar and physician, saw the world differently. He saw the constant conflict between the papacy and secular rulers tearing Europe apart. He saw power being used not for peace, but for control. And so, in 1324, alongside his colleague John of Jandun, he published a book that would change everything. Its title was Defensor Pacis, or the Defender of Peace. The title sounds gentle, but its contents were revolutionary. In its pages, Marsilius made an argument so radical, so dangerous, that it forced him to flee for his life. What did he say? He argued that the source of all political power is not God, but the people, the citizens. He called them the legislator humanis. He believed that a community has the right to make its own laws and to elect its own ruler. The ruler, in turn, is not a master but a servant, accountable to the people who chose him. If he becomes a tyrant, the people have the right to remove him. Today, we call this popular sovereignty. In the 14th century, it was an explosion. But Marsilius didn't stop there. He turned his attention to the most powerful institution of his time, the Church. He argued that the Pope's claim to supreme authority over kings and governments was baseless. He believed the Church's role was spiritual, not political. It should have no armies, no coercive power, and no authority to interfere in worldly affairs. The clergy, including the Pope himself, should be subject to the same laws as everyone else. He was drawing a line, a clear separation between church and state, nearly 500 years before the concept would be enshrined in modern constitutions. Imagine the shockwaves. In an era where the Pope could excommunicate an emperor and bring an entire kingdom to its knees, Marsilius was saying the Pope was just another citizen. He argued that the final authority in matters of faith was not the Pope, but a general council representing all believers, a kind of spiritual democracy. The reaction was swift and furious. Pope John XXI condemned Marsilius as a heretic. His book was banned, and anyone caught reading it faced severe punishment. Marsilius and his friend John had to escape Paris under the cover of darkness, seeking refuge with the Holy Roman Emperor, Ludwig of Bavaria, who was himself locked in a bitter struggle with the Pope. For Marsilius, there was no going back. He would spend the rest of his life in exile, his name a symbol of defiance. But here's what makes his story so compelling. Marsilius did not see the world he helped create. He never heard the phrases separation of church and state, popular sovereignty, or the rule of law. These words didn't exist yet. His ideas were seeds planted in frozen ground. They were too early for the world he lived in, too advanced for a time built on obedience. Yet, ideas have a life of their own. They don't die with their authors. They travel silently, from one forbidden manuscript to another, from one whispered conversation to the next. Marsilius's thoughts went underground, but they did not disappear. Centuries later, during the Renaissance, as Europe began to rediscover reason, his ideas resurfaced. They were there during the Protestant Reformation, when reformers challenged the authority of the Pope. They echoed loudly during the Enlightenment, as thinkers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau argued that government must be based on the consent of the governed. They flowed into the American and French revolutions, shaping the very documents that define modern democracy. Marsilius was among the first to declare that power is not sacred, that authority is not divine, that no institution, no matter how ancient or holy, stands above reason and the law. In an age that demanded submission, he chose thought. And that choice was a revolution in itself. So why does a 14th century thinker still matter today? Because the struggles he wrote about are still our struggles. We still debate the limits of power. We still argue over who should rule and in whose name. We still see authorities wrap themselves in flags, ideologies, or even faith to avoid being held accountable. Marsilius reminds us that questioning authority is not an act of betrayal, it's an act of responsibility. He teaches us that true peace is not built on fear or forced silence, but on consent and participation. It's built by people who are free to speak, to disagree, and to choose their own leaders. He shows us that faith doesn't need a sword to be strong. In fact, it weakens the moment it relies on force. Morality cannot be dictated, and justice cannot be born from fear. These aren't medieval lessons. They are urgent, modern warnings. Marsilius of Padua did not die a glorious martyr's death. He wasn't a general who led armies or a king who built empires. He died quietly in exile, a condemned man in the eyes of the powerful. But history has a funny way of choosing who to remember. It often forgets the names of the powerful but cherishes the questions of the thinkers. He did something far more powerful than lead a rebellion. He asked an honest question at a time when questions were forbidden. And his story proves that sometimes, one brave, honest question is all it takes to begin cracking the walls of eternity. Thank you for watching. If you found this story inspiring, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you don't miss our next journey into history's most fascinating minds.